Good evening and welcome. My name is Dr Iona Hine and I'm the Programme Manager at the Cambridge Interfaith Programme based in the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's event. This is a book launch and we are here to celebrate Emily Qureshi Hurst's new book, Decoding the Cosmos. Emily herself is here to tell us all what it's about. It's an absolute delight today that we are co-hosting this event with Oxford Interfaith Forum. It's the first time that we have collaborated together, and Dr Thea Gomelauri will be hosting the Q&A. So once we have heard from Emily, we will then hear responses from Professor Mark Harris and Allan Furic, both at the University of Oxford, who will offer some different reflections on Emily's book. Then we will open to some questions and discussion. When we get to the questions and discussion, Thea will be managing that, but you can use the Q&A function on Zoom. You may use the chat if that's your preferred way, or you can put your Zoom hand up if you would like to speak. We will be finishing the session at 6:30 for those who have other places to be. So we will get going at this point. Over to you, Emily. Tell us about your book.
Thank you so much, Iona. And thank you so much to everyone who's here. I know that a book launch is less tempting when there's not free wine available. So I appreciate you being here virtually. I don't want to speak for too long because I want to hear from you or from questions and also from our two respondents as well. But I will just give a brief introduction to the book. So I have it here. It's called Decoding the Cosmos, which you will know from signing up and from seeing this slide. And effectively what I'm trying to do in the book is to explore the interface between Christian theology and contemporary physics. It's a firmly introductory book, so there's not necessarily lots of new research in there. It's more a culmination of the work that I've done over the last 10 years or so in this area. So I wrote the book whilst I was developing the 2 undergraduate lecture courses that I give here at Cambridge. And therefore it's got undergraduates in mind. But it's also for people who are interested in these topics in Christian theology and physics, but may not have very much formal training in the area. I'm hoping that it's an accessible, relatively easy read. I'm also not trying to argue for a specific view, which I think makes a book like this, a science and religion book, relatively unusual. For books in this field for a general audience, you typically get people who are religious arguing that science and religion are perfectly compatible, or you get people who are atheists who argue that science can disprove religion. And I'm an atheist, but I'm not trying to use science to disprove religion. I don't really think that science can disprove religion. So I try and present the arguments in a relatively balanced way. There are, of course, times when I say I think this argument is better than another, but I want to let readers make up their own minds about these really complex and interesting issues. So I thought in terms of my introduction today, I'll just speak a little bit about each chapter. I've decided in the book to structure, but I guess there's 2 ways you could go about it. So you could either go through the various different physics theories and talk about how theology interacts with those, or you can start with the theological material and structure the scientific material around that. And that second approach is the more unusual approach, but it's the approach that I've gone for. And I think it makes most sense because Christian theology, the Christian worldview, is a self-contained system with all of the various doctrines interlinking with each other. They're self-supporting. And so if we're wanting to know how compatible contemporary physics is with Christian theology, I think we need to start with the system, with the cohesive worldview as religious believers, as Christians understand it. So with that in mind, I go through 5 key doctrines, starting with creation, then I move to design, then providence, and then finishing with incarnation and then salvation. So in the creation chapter, I look at different ways of understanding the Christian doctrine of creation, drawing from scripture, but also from tradition. And then I look to Big Bang cosmology, so the scientific theory about how the universe began, and compare how compatible these different understandings of creation are with Big Bang cosmology. And the 2 that I engage with are young Earth creationism, so the idea that the Earth was created around 6,000 years ago, 6 to 10,000 years ago, in one fell swoop. So there's no human, animal, or celestial evolution, really. That's clearly incompatible with the science. But then I looked at old Earth creationism, which takes a more metaphorical and layered approach to scriptural interpretation, and says that really the doctrine of creation is about ultimate dependence of everything that exists upon God. And if that's the case, then it's perfectly compatible with the science in my view. So that's the creation chapter. Then in the second chapter on design, I look at the design or teleological argument for God's existence. So trying to argue for the existence of God on the basis of apparent order, complexity, beauty in the universe, and see whether data from physics, specifically cosmic fine-tuning data, can help this argument be more successful. And I assess an atheistic interpretation of fine-tuning data and a theistic interpretation of fine-tuning data and kind of pit them against each other. And again, leave it up to readers to decide which they think is best. Then after that, I move on to providence. So thinking about how God interacts with the world. And I look at a particular way of understanding divine action in the context of quantum mechanics, which was originally developed by Robert John Russell. So he argued that quantum indeterminacy opens up space for divine action in a way that allows God to act in the world without having to break the laws of nature. So God acts in and through the quantum laws to enact his will. And it gives a very intimate view of the creature, creator, creation relationship. But I argue that there is a chance that it raises the problem of evil in a more significant and perhaps more damaging way than some other views of divine providence, which take a more detached view of the relationship between God and the world. Then in the incarnation chapter, I take a dual focus. So I start by looking at space and time and think about what it might mean for an atemporal, non-physical, aspatial God to take on physical form at a particular spatial place in a moment in time, and weigh up different ways of understanding how plausible this is. Is this compatible with the doctrine of the Trinity? Does it make sense to say some Trinitarian persons are temporal and others aren't? Those kinds of things. And then in the second half, I look to the possibility of alien life. So this part is very speculative, but I think particularly interesting. So thinking about if there is intelligent life elsewhere in the universe, then do we have just one incarnation for the whole cosmos, the one that happened here? Or does it make more sense to say there are actually multiple incarnations that occur throughout space and time and involve God hypostatically unifying himself to different forms of creaturely flesh? And although this is a very speculative area of science and theology, I think it helps us also focus in on what matters to us in a doctrine of incarnation. Is uniqueness important? Is union with a particular created form more important? So those are the kind of questions I address there. And then in the final chapter, I look to salvation. And this is where I translate, I guess, a lot of the work that I've done, the more technical philosophical work in the relationship between time and salvation. And I try and package that up in a way that's less philosophically dense and a bit more accessible. So thinking about what it means to say that salvation involves a transformation in time, and eschatology involving something that happens at the end of time. So this dual temporal focus of being within and also outside of and after time. And I close the book by reflecting on the general state of the relationship between physics and Christianity, suggesting that there are some areas of real resonance between these two frameworks, worldviews, but also areas of incompatibility as well. And I think it remains a rich and interesting and very fruitful area of dialogue between religion and science. And although some people in the field want to move us on to other topics, because physics and theology was really an early focus of science and religion as a discipline, I think there's still really interesting things that we can say about these two overarching worldviews and approaches to understanding the world. So it's kind of a call to keep up with this kind of work. Thank you very much for listening. And I'll hand back over to Iona.
Thank you, Emily. So you have heard in elegantly brief fashion about the contents of the book, and what we're now going to hear is a couple of responses. Our first respondent is Professor Mark Harris. Mark describes himself as a theologian of science, interested in the complex ways that the natural sciences and religious beliefs relate to each other. He has been at the University of Oxford since 2023, where he occupies the Andreas Idrios Chair in Science and Religion and directs the Ian Ramsey Centre. Following Professor Mark Harris, we'll hear from Allan Furic. Allan is a DPhil candidate in Science and Religion at the University of Oxford, and his research explores the intuitive interconnectedness of reality through convergent perspectives in quantum metaphysics and Buddhist philosophy. So we'll be hearing from each of them in turn to give some different reflections on Emily's work. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Iona, and thank you, Emily, for such a wonderful book. Really great piece of work. And you've already said some of the main points, the way you pitched it. And I think I want to take a few of my own angles on it, I suppose. People who don't know me will realize that I'm a physicist myself with interests in theology. And exactly as Emily said towards the end, physics has become a rather neglected science in the science and religion conversation, but I'm totally with Emily in wanting to push it forward again. I think there's lots and lots of things that physics has to say to us who are interested in the theological and religious implications. Having said that, I was particularly interested in Emily's pitch at the beginning, saying right up front that she's an atheist, and that's the perspective she's taking, which I think is a really interesting stance because, as Emily said herself, it's not often taken in the science and religion world, at least not unless you're wanting to make a particular point about being an atheist. I think Emily does it in a very non-preachy, non-programmatic way and manages to speak about the science and the theology in a very balanced way, helping the reader make up their own mind, which I thought was a really excellent approach. How does Emily arrange her topics? Well, you've already heard Emily mention that she has 5 big themes, which are arranged around theological themes. Now, I thought this was very interesting for a couple of reasons. First, of course, Emily makes the point that Christian theology is a self-contained system, so it provides a coherent way to organize the material. Now, she doesn't say it explicitly, but the implication I felt is that physics isn't a self-contained or tidy system. Actually, I think that's right. I don't think physics is very tidy or self-contained. And I say that as a particular kind of physicist myself, a condensed matter physicist. There are robust disagreements between different kinds of physicists over whose area is most fundamental, or even whether one particular kind of physics actually counts as real physics. You'll find people actually disagreeing with each other over whether you're a physicist or not in the field. They're very foundational disagreements over what exactly counts as physics and what doesn't. Now, the disagreements in theology, on the other hand, and we all know that there certainly are disagreements, 2,000 years of Western history shows that, those disagreements are of a completely different kind and much less foundational. So I think it's a surprising feature of theology compared with physics. There's much more unanimity between theologians over the state and the scope of the field than there is between physicists. All of this means that I think Emily's entirely right to organize her material using these 5 big themes. The upshot I felt is that it cuts across a little bit, or rather reminiscent of a systematic theology, an attempt to cover Christian doctrine systematically. But no, I guess, and this might come from Emily's atheist perspective, there's no chapter on church or humanity, and there's attempt to really talk clearly about the being of God, although her design chapter might count as the chapter on the being of God, because that looks at the age-old question of whether the creator is in effect a designer by looking at the state-of-the-art physics idea of fine-tuning. And you could take the introduction as the chapter on the church, because it examines how science and religion scholars, as a social entity, have tried to wrestle with understanding the idea of science and religion. Now, what Emily does, having said that it comes across a little bit like a systematic theologian, Emily does really adopt the methodology of a philosopher of religion in particular. And I think that's very appropriate for this kind of material. I think her discussion throughout is extremely clear and accessible. For instance, in the chapter on design, she discusses the intriguing phenomenon around fine-tuning. Is that a scientific idea, which is thoroughly supported by evidence from physics? Is it evidence of a designer God or of many universes, of which ours is just one? And there's a very interesting discussion there where Emily effectively says these are competing explanations, competing theories, if you like, one scientific and the other theological. Well, what Emily does here is she takes the philosopher's approach to dissect assumptions behind both theories and take us back to thinking about how theories work in the first place. So ultimately, we want the theory to be accurate in the way it predicts our observations and to be conceptually simple. And while both theories, the physics and the theology, they both get the observations right, they're anything but simple. And I thought this was an interesting move that Emily makes at this point to discuss the nature of simplicity. She makes the point that simplicity is, in fact, rather complicated. For one thing, we need to decide between whether we are majoring on quantitative simplicity, how many entities do we need to make a theory work, or qualitative simplicity, what kinds of entities. And once we make that distinction, Emily points out that the many universes theory is actually more appealing than the God theory because it's qualitatively more simple. Now, I was quite intrigued by that conclusion because I know that in Emily's previous work, where she's been discussing many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, she's rather critical of that approach. But here she seems to be leaning towards many universes. And I wonder if maybe atheism is tipping the balance. I don't know, I'd like to hear. But for myself, as a physicist who's also a theist, I'm happy to go with both theories simultaneously. I don't really see them as being in competition. So I'd love to hear what Emily thinks there. One last thought is to just say a few words about Emily's discussion of quantum mechanics, which, because we're dealing with modern physics here, runs right the way through the book, but particularly appears, as mentioned in the chapter on providence, divine action, and effect, particularly on Bob Russell's theory of God working through quantum mechanics, which is a very well-known idea. Now, I'm entirely in agreement with the way that Emily treats this, but where I think I part company with her is in her closing assessment of the divine action debate, which she says has not been a resounding success. I think she's probably right there, insofar as I often hear the comment made that, oh gosh, divine action, we're not getting back to that again, are we? I thought we'd all got bored of it. I personally think it's a very important area that we need to keep at in science and religion. The reason is, or the reason why I say that, is because if science and religion is to move beyond naive natural theology when we're trying to assess scientific evidence and to investigate the possibility that God might actively and presently be revealed in the world, then the divine action debate is always going to be central to what we do, however faltering and mistaken it has been so far. So I would always want to promote the divine action debate, really, but that might be, again, my theistic convictions coming through. So overall, I thought this was a really splendid book. There's lots of good sense and wisdom here, exploring the conversation between physics and theology. So I will stop there.
Thank you. Over to you, Allan.
Hello. Thank you very much, Iona. Let me just start by saying thank you to Emily for such a wonderful book. I think it was a great addition and also a great way, I think, to bridge the gap that we tend to have in the academy, doing some studies that may be too complicated, too difficult to access for the general audience. And I think that's a great way to remedy that issue. So congratulations for that. I thought I could actually talk about, well, give an insight into what my research for general audience, then again, would have to say as a response to that book, because I was actually struck by when I saw Emily's structure in the book, in the different themes that she mentioned, that actually there is only one of them that corresponds to the Buddhist tradition, and only one. And I thought that was actually quite revelatory of the differences we apprehend the science and religion dialogue. So let me just briefly mention them. In the Buddhist tradition, there is no concept of a creator deity, right? This is something that the Buddhists would not really subscribe to. And for different reasons, one of them is philosophical, is that the concept of a first cause, Aristotelian first cause, doesn't make sense for the Buddhist. And so with that token, they would reject altogether the idea that there would have been such creator entity that would engender the universe and everything that's in it. And obviously, when you jettison the idea of a creator, then everything that comes with it, including thinking of design, providence, incarnation, especially in the Christian theological framework, where you have to relinquish those as well, because they don't really make sense outside that framework. And that's why I think I agree with Emily that Christianity, in this sense, is a self-contained system that is not neatly compatible with other faith traditions. The last one is actually the only one where you can see an interesting bridge that can be formed, salvation, though I think we should probably be careful about the usage of that term, Because in the Christian context, salvation has come through the person of Jesus Christ. In the Buddhist context, it's something deeply internal, personal. It's not something that is being given by someone else, in that case, Jesus Christ, the incarnation of God, but something that comes through us, through a deep experiential meditative practice. It's something that the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, achieved after meditating for 40 days and nights at the bottom of a tree. And so I think that's interesting to see how, in this case, the physics that's obviously Emily showcases how there is a complex intersection between the modern physics and Christian theology. But in the case of the Buddhist tradition here, we have even less to build upon, I think. So you can find probably more of a harmony, generally speaking, between Christian theology and modern physics than with the Buddhist tradition here. Another example would be when you consider creation and the theory of the Big Bang in modern physics. This is something you can't really have as well in the Buddhist tradition because the universe is cyclical, right? It runs on itself. A good expression of that would be the series The Wheel of Time on Amazon, if you're familiar with it, which really represents that idea. So I thought that, generally speaking, I thought that was an amazing book. And I really liked the stance she took by trying to take the hand of a reader, to accompany them, to try to explain to them the different ideas, areas we work on as science and religion scholars, and also to let them make their own decision, take their own decision, try to ponder the pros and cons of the compatibility or incompatibility of those two systems. So I thought that was a really good example, if I can go as far, of cultural relativism in the pursuit of truth, in my opinion. And I would just like to conclude on those words, but I think really reflects Emily's perspective, taken from a famous astrophysicist from the last century, Arthur Eddington, whom Mark is quite fond of. And Eddington used to say that truth shines ahead as a beacon showing us the path. We do not ask to attain it. It is better far that we be permitted to see. And I think that Emily's book is really helping us on that path, trying to expand the horizon of our questioning as meaning-making creatures. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It is my great honor to host the Q&A. But before we start the discussion, I want to say how grateful I am to Dr. Iona Hine for including Oxford Interfaith Forum in this fantastic book event about decoding the cosmos. We are delighted to be part of it, and I welcome and I'm delighted to see so many familiar faces and names on the screen. So we are really going to have a fruitful discussion. Thank you for all the presenters, the contributors. While our audience is formulating their questions, Emily, perhaps I would start asking my own. First of all, I am a little far from science, but very much involved in religion and theology and interfaith, and I delighted because it was a very accessible book. It doesn't require very specific scientific knowledge. So I want to thank you for producing this very accessible book for non-specialists, so to speak. And on a personal level, you're speaking, and the title is very catchy, Decoding the Cosmos. And since we are speaking about the decoding of many perceptions, concepts, what did you decode for yourself while you've been working on this wonderful project? Were there any concepts that really became a revelation during your work?
I really like that question. I think one of the conclusions I came to, or one of the conclusions I'm beginning to come to, is that I don't think these arguments are actually as persuasive as they've been taken by lots of people working in the field. I think they're really important and valuable things to think about, intellectual exercises, ways of, for religious believers, shoring up their faith, and for atheists, kind of bolstering their opposition to faith. But actually, I think in terms of convincing people to switch sides, as it were, or to change their perspective, they don't seem to be very effective to me. And I've been wondering about whether this means that religious faith, your worldview, your atheism as well, is formed in a slightly different register to the register that analytic, rational arguments take place in. So it's far more common to see somebody being converted to religion through a religious experience or losing faith due to something terrible happening to them than it is to I don't know, have a kind of Damascene conversion because of being faced with a really robust version of the cosmological argument. It just doesn't seem that individuals work that way. Maybe that's not something so great to say when I've just written a book about all of these different arguments. But I do think it reveals something interesting about our positionality as believers, as meaning-making creatures, as individuals who form worldviews and try and understand the world in the context of those views, that the arguments alone aren't going to be enough. You're going to need something deeper and more personal, more emotional as well. So the arguments are useful, but they can't decode the cosmos on their own, I guess.
Thank you very much. And I think it's most respectful way, just showing your argument and allowing people to make a decision rather than engaging arguments and showing. Thank you very much. I would love to engage with you more, but I'm mindful that we already have questions coming in and I won't abuse my power, so to speak. So first question comes from our fellow Daniel Diaz. The question, which theologians did you draw from to make sense of Christian soteriology vis-a-vis philosophy of time? I could imagine Augustine's famous reflection might be an important piece, but I'm curious if you could explore other Christian thinkers that would have different insight.
So the research that I'm drawing on heavily in that chapter is research that I wrote or that I developed originally during my PhD. And in the PhD, I am in dialogue most heavily with Paul Tillich. So Tillician understandings of soteriology are there, definitely in the background, sometimes written about explicitly. But I try not to take one particular theological perspective. I guess it's a very philosopher's way of approaching things, to try and take the ideas in their most basic and common forms across the various different theological expressions and engage with those. So it's less of a deep dive on particular theologians like I've done in other work, and more about trying to distill the core features of the doctrine and then bringing those into dialogue with science and philosophy. And there are benefits and pitfalls to that approach. So it keeps things general, it keeps things accessible and short as well, because if I'm trying to deal with all of the different theologians and all of their views, the book gets very, very long indeed. But it does mean that sometimes, I guess I could be accused of sometimes doing a kind of God of the philosophers approach rather than the God of theologians. So yeah, there are downsides to taking a more abstracted view of things, definitely.
Thank you very much, Emily. That's fantastic. And I want to encourage our fellows. Okay, David, thank you very much. Go ahead.
My background is more many years ago in geology, geophysics, rather than physics. And at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that you'd taken two major views, one of which was young Earth creationism, which is the idea of 6,000 years and Genesis, early Genesis chapters being almost documentary literal history. And your second one was what you called old Earth creationism, which was much more gentle and open to science. Are you drawing a distinction between old Earth creationism and a third one, which is called theistic evolution, which is one that really says, let's take the science as it is and work from there? And so how does early Genesis fit into that? In particular, from a theological point of view, take into account ancient Near East considerations. I'm just wondering if you could unpack that distinction between old Earth creationism and theistic evolution a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So one of the first things I say when I'm introducing old Earth creationism is that it's an incredibly broad church indeed, and contains lots of different views within it. So really, I'm defining it in opposition to young Earth creationism and saying within this, you can be a bit more of a literalist and accept the scientific accounts of the age of the universe, the age of the earth, but still see Genesis as having some elements of literalism in there. So instead of describing literal 24-hour days, it's describing created epochs, but these are still to be taken relatively literally if we just expand the temporal duration of those epochs. And then I say there are other ways of understanding old Earth creationism, or other ways of being an old Earth creationist, that take a very, very metaphorical approach to scripture and just talk about this relation of absolute dependence. And there, you're perfectly free to take the science exactly as it is and go from there. So I don't engage at that point specifically with theistic evolution, although it does actually come into things a little bit in the quantum mechanics and divine action chapter, because the evolutionary process is one of the places that Bob Russell locates as a context for divine action happening in like genetic mutations and stuff. And unfortunately, I don't talk about the ancient Near Eastern religions in the chapter very much. But I do try and emphasize that this old Earth creationist view actually contains a huge melting pot of different perspectives, within which theistic evolution is one, slightly more literalistic approach is another. And really what I'm trying to say there is scriptural interpretation is really, really important when it comes to these issues of creation. So how you approach Genesis as a text is going to really inform how open you are to various different scientific theories and scientific perspectives. And if you take it as a literal, historical, almost scientific textbook, that's going to lead you in one direction. But if you take a more layered, metaphorical, in my view, sophisticated approach to the text that sees it as a complex piece of writing that contains many different layers of meaning, then you're much more free to open yourself up to various different scientific theories. Obviously, my focus here is physics, but I do mention geology as well and evolution, of course, because all of these converge on the same age of the Earth and therefore, similar age of the cosmos as well. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
While we are waiting for the questions, Emily, perhaps you wanted to pick up some of the points that Mark and Allan suggested, and perhaps the three of you wanted to exchange a little more points.
Yeah, so I'll pick up on Mark's point about the divine action debates. So I think that he's right that divine action is an important area of science and religion dialogue. It's where the Venn diagram meets and there's that gap and that overlap in the middle. It's a very natural topic to fall there. And to those of you who aren't familiar with the history of science and religion, which may be lots of you, the divine action project out of which this theory about quantum mechanics and divine action came is probably the longest and most significant project in science and religion to date. It spanned 20 years. It generated, I think, 6 edited volumes, lots and lots of books, conference presentations, articles. And it took, over the course of those 20 years, different focuses. So neuroscience, evolution, quantum mechanics. And as an overarching project, I'm less familiar with the non-physicsy areas of it. I didn't want to suggest that the whole of the divine action project hasn't been particularly successful. It was specifically Bob Russell's NIODA, or the non-interventionist objective divine action, that I think hasn't taken off or hasn't been as successful as perhaps it seemed like it might be in its early days. And that's not to say that it's not a fantastically creative, innovative and interesting proposal. When I first read the first article on this topic, I was blown away by how clever and creative it was. But when I started to dig deeper, the flaws kind of emerged for me. So I think, and there's been lots of stuff published since critiquing it from different angles. And I don't think it's taken off as a widely accepted model for how God acts in the world, for various reasons, which are some more technical than others. But I do agree that we shouldn't just give up on trying to find ways of understanding divine action in the world. And one of the reasons is because, and this is something I talk about in the providence chapter, we can think of providence as being split into 2 different kinds. So you've got general providence on the one hand and special providence on the other. General providence is broadly the kind of doctrine of creation. God created the universe, sustained it at every moment, created the laws of nature. And it's the laws of nature part that's important. And then special providence is specific action in the world at a definite time and place, miracles, religious experiences, that kind of thing. Both of these are supposed to come from God. They're supposed to have a divine source. And so we shouldn't see an incompatibility between them, between specific miracle events that happen in space and time, other areas of divine action as well, answering prayers, that kind of thing, and the laws of nature, i.e. our scientific theories. We should expect to see a synergy between those. And so I do think that's something that we should continue to pursue, even if the specific proposal of Bob Russell that I engaged with in the book leaves something to be desired, in my view.
Mark, do you want to respond to Bob? perhaps we'll go back. Yes.
So the Bob Russell idea, you're absolutely right, Emily. There was an awful lot published on other areas of science and how divine action might work in there. But the Bob Russell proposal is the only one that really generated very much interest. So much to be published on that one theory alone. But you're absolutely right. It's got a lot of flaws. I suspect that all other theories do as well. It's an annoying feature of the field, and I think that's why so many have given up on it. But yeah, I think you and I probably both agree we need to keep on at it.
Thank you very much. Yes. Greg, nice. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask question?
Just following up on what Mark said, really. So now that you've had time to reflect on this whole process that you've been through, Emily, what has it opened in your mind in the way that you've gone about your academic work, and what's the next step? Where's this going to go next? And is that something that you're working on now, or is that something that's going to come next? So that's what I'm curious about.
Thank you. Yeah. So one of the things that it's taught me, which is I think a skill that all academics need to learn, is that writing clearly is very, very important. And it's sometimes something that we neglect when we're writing for our academic colleagues, when we're writing these long monographs, these technical single author books, or articles in journals. It's quite easy to fall back on jargon and to write in these kind of obscure, obtuse sentences that is difficult for people to understand. And I found the process of writing this book really helpful, because both in terms of clarifying my thoughts, but also in terms of thinking about how I'm going to teach this material, because some of this is really, really complicated. I mean, quantum mechanics is so complicated. And I'm trying to teach undergraduates who are in theology, not science. And so it was really, really helpful in teaching me how to think really clearly and how to explain things very clearly. And so I hope that I'm going to take that back into my more academic writing for an academic audience. And it was also helpful in the process to have people who are not academics read the book. So an example is my brother Ben, who is on the call. He read the book and was really helpful in pointing out some of the areas where I just fell back into technical philosophy jargon. And he was like, what's this? This doesn't make any sense. And that's so helpful, because for me, I think in both modes. I think in the technical philosopher, theologian mode of dialogue, and in a kind of the way we all ordinarily speak to each other. And so sometimes I don't notice as clearly when I'm moving between them. So it was really, really helpful to have academics read a draft of the manuscript, but also non-academics, so that I could really make sure that I was conveying the ideas really clearly. And as for where I'm going next, things are on the horizon. I don't know how much I can share at the moment, but there's a grant that I will be working on to do with quantum mechanics and theology. So the next project is going to be looking at quantum mechanics, specifically the many world interpretation for me, and its implications for theism, what happens or what follows when we take the many worlds interpretation as a worldview, what follows for other areas of human experience, personal identity, moral responsibility, that kind of thing. So that will be occupying me for the next 3 years or so. But first, I'm going to be having a baby. But after that, I'll be writing about quantum mechanics and theology.
Will you be writing that for the mere mortals in the room or for an academic audience?
It's going to be a bit of both. So the book that I'm going to write is going to be, I guess, a kind of hybrid. So it will have original research in it, but it will be for a slightly more accessible audience. But then I'll also be writing papers as well, which will be for academic journals and, yeah, jargon-filled and very boring to most people.
Wonderful. Congratulations on this new initiative, and we will look forward to hearing more in due time. But now, can we slide? Perhaps Allan, you wanted to respond back? Or Emily, do you want to respond to Allan? Because his response was more sort of going beyond. You particularly mentioned Christianity, and Allan brought Buddhism. Perhaps you could also include a little bit in this discussion, because since we are on Interfaith Forum on both ends, to be more inclusive, please. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so the reason that I wanted Allan to be part of this event is because the whole of science and religion is very, very dominated by Christianity and Christian perspectives on the relationship between religion and science. There is a growing cohort of Islamic scholars who are interested in religion and science as well. But Buddhism has been woefully absent, and it's a real shame. And this is Allan's area of expertise. He works on quantum physics and Buddhism. And I really wanted to hear Allan's perspective as somebody working in a completely different faith tradition, not just a different set of doctrinal claims, but within monotheism, but a completely different worldview and way of constructing a worldview. I thought it was interesting to hear that when looking at the different chapters, the only area of overlap really was salvation, but it's a salvation of a very, very different kind, a salvation that comes from within. And I wondered, I'd love to hear Allan say a little bit more about how salvation of that kind might interact with physics. Not to think too much on the spot, Allan, but I'd love to hear a bit more.
Thank you. That's a great question, a complex one, because as some of you may know, the main area of engagement between Buddhism and the sciences would be cognitive and neuroscience. Why? Because of such a strong emphasis on the mind, on consciousness, right? Because the whole Buddhist project is really to try to understand where suffering comes from and try to overcome that suffering, that human suffering, which you can extend to other species as well, especially in the Mahayana movement. The salvation idea in this case is really to try to overcome that suffering by reaching the state of nirvana, which is the technical term that comes from the different texts, the sutras. In relation to quantum physics, this is a harsh question because this is something, as I mentioned during my last presentation that Emily attended, you could make a strong claim, which would have to be backed, is to say that somehow in deep states of meditation where the brain functions differently, the meditative practitioner manages to access something that could explain how their description of the experiments they go through is so different, so inordinate, if that makes sense, something completely at odds with our everyday apprehension of reality. Because in some sutras, Buddhist philosophers and Buddhist practitioners would describe how the world is fundamentally interconnected, that the one contains the many, that we're all everywhere all at once, and that there is even some sort of timeless perspective and bidirectional causality. So this is something we simply cannot experience, right? But I don't actually know to what extent neuroscience would support that for different physical reasons. That's why I think that actually there seemed to be much more kinship between Christian theology in this case and modern physics. And I don't actually know whether we should discard some core doctrines of another tradition if, like, science disproves them, right? That would be the position of the Dalai Lama, that if science disproves a Buddhist doctrine or concept, we need to jettison it. I'm not entirely convinced, as you said, Emily. I think they need to help each other, identify the differences and similarities to further the dialogue regarding the nature of the world and our existence in it. Yeah.
Is the Dalai Lama unusual within Buddhism for taking that view? Because it seemed like that kind of view is more the view that you'd associate with someone like what Richard Dawkins would just say, get rid of all of it. But like somebody, an atheist of that persuasion, who says if something doesn't fit with the science, we should get rid of it. It seems like that's something you would be less likely to hear from a religious person, especially the leader of a religion.
Yeah. But the thing is, the Dalai Lama, because of his position as a spiritual leader in Tibet, well, used to be in Tibet, unfortunately no longer, has a very strong voice, right? So it's actually difficult to argue against him. And he's well-versed into many of the texts and many of the sutras, but he's also really happy to engage with the scientists, which he has been doing ever since the 1990s, and some even world experts in physics and cognitive science. The thing which is important is that in Buddhism, because there is no belief in a creator deity, there is also no sense of any form of revelation. Mm-hmm. And because there is no revelation, the Buddhist tradition cannot really be considered to follow one orthodoxy. And so, like, you have actually theories that are mutually incompatible in the Buddhist tradition. And so, especially like when you take the Mahayana movement, which is more effective in the North and East Asia, which considerably developed the philosophy, you could find ideas which would be at odds with the original principles that you find in the Theravada lineage, for example. And so I think that accommodates perhaps more easily the evolution of science as well, right? Because they can work more in tandem when compared to Christian theology, which, because it's revealed, doesn't mean you cannot argue about the meaning of the doctrines. Like, it's more set in stone compared to Buddhism.
Yes, we have just a question suggested from Iona, wonderful question. Your relationship with the publisher and how did you persuade? What was the publisher's motivation? Perhaps you could explain in the broader sense what motivated publisher to particularly want this title and this topic, the book series.
Yeah, the publisher actually approached me and they said they were looking for somebody to write an accessible book on physics and Christianity, and knew that that was the area that I worked on and would I be interested in it. And I think they wanted something that could be used as a resource for undergraduates and be read more widely. So it was the publisher's idea to take things in a more accessible direction. But I was on a junior research fellowship at the time, which had written into the contract that I had to do public engagement work. So work that wasn't just restricted to academic publishing, but involved public speaking or podcasts, YouTube channels, things that had reached outside of the academy. And so it seemed like the perfect fit. And so I enthusiastically said yes.
Fantastic. From Mina, perhaps it will be the last question. She has posted here the reference from Zygon. Are there any good reasons why you think your future direction of research might be quantum theology?
I don't know what you mean by a good reason. I guess one of the reasons I think it's a productive line of inquiry to engage with quantum mechanics in a theological way is because quantum mechanics is by far the most successful scientific theory that we've ever had. And so if we think of science or hope that science is a means by which we can gain truth about the world, arrive at true conclusions about how the world really is, quantum mechanics seems to be at the moment our best bet. We can make predictions on the basis of the theory that can be matched by the data to like 1 part in a trillion. It's extremely accurate in its ability to make predictions. So in that sense, it's a very, very robust empirical foundation on which to build theological inquiry. But then on the other hand, there are still loads of unanswered philosophical, metaphysical questions about what quantum physics really tells us about the world in a more general sense. So you've got the Copenhagen interpretation, you've got Bohmian mechanics, the many worlds interpretation. These are all fundamentally incompatible worldviews, incompatible physical theories based on the same empirical data. So there's huge amounts of scope for philosophical exploration about what quantum mechanics really tells us. We know it's telling us something fundamentally true about the world, but what is it? So for the philosopher and theologian, that is an incredibly rich mine to tap into.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Emily. It remains to me to thank all the participants, but before I do it, I would like to use this opportunity to make just a little announcement, also the information. Emily, you mentioned that how important was also the scriptural study and scriptural approach, the way how we interpret scripture determines our understanding in science and religion. And since we are studying this wonderful collaboration, and the Cambridge Interfaith Program has a very rich offering, which you will see on their website, I also want to mention that our next event would be on the book of Job, which is a very cosmological book. I just want to mention that there is a lot of cosmological events, and you all will be most welcome to engage again in this very philosophical and scientific discussion why there is innocent suffering, why bad things happen to good people like Job. And also, I want to give you this a little feedback because you speak, one of the important chapters was on incarnation, and we are delighted. I take this opportunity to announce it in advance that our next collaborative joint project with the Cambridge Interfaith Forum we will be hosting in January, and we will be discussing this issue with the Islamic perspective. Incarnation, and we will have wonderful Islamic scholars. So you watch our announcements and you will be most welcome. Now, thank you. It remains me to say the privilege of final thank yous to you for gifting us with this wonderful resource, with this Decoding of Cosmos, and to our invited special guests, Professor Harris and Allan Furic, for your wonderful enriching our discussions, and to every one of you for attending and for spreading the word about this wonderful book that should be in everyone's desk. Thank you very much to everyone, and particularly thank you for Iona for organizing and for inviting all of us to this wonderful event. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And thank you to Iona and Thea as well for helping to organise this event, and to Mark and Allan for your responses. Really appreciate it. So thank you so much. Bye.